Bueno everyone, this is Stave Dewey of the Christmas Carolette. I was meant to be reading this with my puppy, dressed as Santa, but she's not playing ball. Never work with children or with animals. So here we are. Stave Dewey, the first of three fairies. When Scrooge awoke, it was so munge that vardering out of bed, she could scarcely distinguish the transparent window from the opaque walls of her boudoir. She was endeavouring to pierce the mungeness with her ferret ewes, when the chimes of a neighbouring Gloria's grotto struck the quarters. So she nelly-yarded for the hour. To her great astonishment, the heavy bell-end went from say to setter, and from setter to otter, and regularly up to Kenza, then stopped. Kenza! It was past Dewey when she went to bed. The clock was wrong. An icicle must have got into the works. Kenza! She reefed the spring of her repeater to correct this most preposterous crock. Its rapid little pulse jar Kenza'd, and then stopped. Why, it isn't possible, screeched Scrooge, that I can have letted through a whole journo and far into another notchy. It isn't possible that anything has happened to the sun, and this is Kenza at noon. The idea being an alarming Una, she scrambled out of bed and groped her way to the window. She was obliged to rub the frost off with the heat from her lucodi before she could ogle anything. She could ogle very little then. All she could make out was that it was still very foggy and extremely cold, and there was no noise of omies et polones mincing to and fro, and making a great vogue, as there is unquestionably would have been, if not she had jar-jarred off bright journo and lel fakement of the world. This was a great relief, because tray journos after vardering the first exchange pay to Miss Mary Scrooge or her order, or so far, would have become a mere United States security if there were no journos to count by. Scrooge went to bed again, and thought, it was over and over, and could make nishta of it. The more she thought, and the more mad-mental she was, and the more she endeavoured not to think, the more she thought. Mary's fairy bothered her exceedingly. Every tempo she revolved within herself, after mature inquiry, as it was all a dream caused by too many uppers, and dobied down her gob of multi-daffy juice, her mind flew back again, like an M&S bra strap, to its first position, and presented the same problem to be worked all through. Was it a dream or not? Scrooge let in this state until the chime had gone 3/4 more, and when she remembered all of a sudden that the fairy had warned her of a visitation when the bell tolled Una, she resolved to lie awake until the hour was past, and considering that she could no more go to letting than she could go to heaven, this was perhaps the wisest resolution in her power. The quarter was so long that she more than once savage she must have sunk into a doze unconsciously, and missed the clock. At length it broke upon her nelly-yardering and aunt-nelling cheat. Ding-dong! A quarter past, screeched Scrooge, counting. Ding-dong! Half-past, screeched Scrooge. Ding-dong! A quarter to it, screeched Scrooge. Ding-dong! The hour itself, screeched Scrooge triumphantly, and nishta else. She cackled before the hour bell-end sounded. Hello. She cackled before the hour bell-end sounded, which now it did with a deep, naffet, hollow, melancholy Una. Sparkle flashed up in the room upon the instant, and the curtains of her bed was drawn. The curtains of her quarter-poster bed were flung aside, all dramatic-like, and no flies by a famble. Not the curtains in her place, nishta the Laurie Ashley curtains at her back, but those to which her eke was addressed. The curtains of her bed were drawn aside, and Scrooge, starting up in a half-recumbent attitude, found herself eke to eke with the naff visitor who drew them. As to close it now as I am now to you, as close to it as now as I am to you, and I am standing in the fairy of your elbow, Ducky. It was a queer, NTBH figure, like a feely, yet not so like a feely as a badge Omi Polone, varded through some supernatural medium, which Parker heard the varder of having receded from view, and being diminished to a chavvy's proportion. Sort of like Jeanette Cranky on the Codjourno. Its raya, which hung around its neck and down its back, was white, as if with age, and yet the eke had not a wrinkle in it, and the tenderest bloom was on the skin. The arms were very long and well thewed, the fambles the same, as if its hold were of an uncommon strength. Its lallies and plates, most delicately formed, were, like those upper members, bare. It wore a drogle of the purest right, and round its waist had bound a lustrous belt, and the screen of which was beautiful. It held a capella of a freshly green holly in its famble, in a singular contradiction of that wintry album. Its dress trimmed with summer flowers, but the queerest fakement about it was, that from its handbag on its head there sprouted a bright clear jet of sparkle, by which all this was visible, and which was doubtless the occasion of its using, in naffetier moments, a great extinguisher for a cap which it now held under its arm. Even this, though, when Scrooge varded it with increasing steadiness, was not its queerest quality, for its belt sparkled and glittered, now in una part and now in another, and what was sparkle una instant and tempo was munge, so figure itself fluctuated in its distinctness, now being now a fakeman with una arm, now with una lally, now with 20 lallies, now a pair of lallies and nanty a head, now a head nanty a lucodi, of which dissolving parts no outline would be visible in the dense gloom wherein they melted away. And in the very wonder of this, it would be itself again, distinct and clear as ever. Are you the fairy, Ducky, whose coming was screecheth to be by Mary? Cackled Scrooge. I am, you trash! The crackling fakeman was soft and gentle. Let me do that again. I am, you trash! The crackling fakeman was soft and gentle, like a deodorant, singularly low, as if, instead of being so close behind her, it was at a distance. Who and what to fuck are you, dear? Scrooge demanded. I am the fairy of Christmas past. Long past? Inquired Scrooge, observant of its dwarfish stature. No, your past. Perhaps Scrooge could not have screeched at anyone why, if anyone could have screeched her, but she had a special fairy to ogle the fairy in her cap, and begged to be covered. She was all overcome with emulsion, and couldn't handle that out-of-season clobber. What? Exclaimed the fairy. Would you so soon put out with worldly fandles the sparkle I give? Is it not enough that you are owner of those passions made this cap, and forced me through a whole trains of anise to wear it naffly upon my brow? Scrooge reverently disclaimed all intention to offend, or any knowledge of having wilfully bonneted the fairy at any period of her life. She then made bold to inquire what business brought the fairy there. "Your welfare!" screeched the fairy, outraged. Scrooge expressed herself much obliged, but she could not help thinking that a notchy of unbroken Letty and a good Barclays would have been more conducive to that end. The fairy must have heard her thinking, for it screeched immediately, "Your reclamation, then. L'll heed you, ungrateful hoe." It put out its spindly fambul as it spoke, and grabbed the narky Vash by the arm. "Rise, and troll with me." It would have been in vain for Scrooge to plead that the weather and the hour were not adapted to trolling purposes, and that her bed was warm, and the thermometer a long way below freezing, and that she was clad scantily in her kitten heels, dressing gown, and notchy cap, and that she had a cold upon her at that tempo. The grasp, though gentle as an Omi Palone's fambul, was not to be resisted. She rose royally, but found that the fairy made towards the window, clasped its frock in supplication. "I am a mortal Vash," Scrooge remonstrated, "and liable to fall in these kitten-heeled slipperettes." "Bear but a reef of my fambul there," cackled the fairy, letting it upon her cart so, "and you shall be upheld in more than this." As the lads were spoken, they passed through the wall, and suddenly upon an open country road, with fields on either fambul. The city had entirely vanished. Not a vestige of it was to be ogled. The mungeness of the mist had vanished from it, for it was a clear, cold, winter journey with snow upon the ground. "Bona heaven!" screeched Scrooge, clasping her fambuls together as she varded around her. "I was bred in this place. I was a feely here." The fairy gazed upon her mildly. Its gentle reef, though it had been dolly and instantaneous, had appeared to present to the Badge Omi Palone's sense of feeling. She was conscious of a milli odours floating in the air, each Una connected with a milli thoughts, and hopes, and dreams, and joys, and cares long, long forgotten. "Your lip is trembling, ducky," cackled the fairy. "And what is that upon your cheek? I mean, the one on your eek." Scrooge muttered, with an unusual catching in her cackling fakement, that it was a pimple, and begged the fairy to lead her where she would. "You recollect the way?" inquired the fairy. "Remember it?" screeched Scrooge with fervour. "I could troll it nanty vada folded." "Strange to have forgotten it for so many annies," ogled the fairy. "Let us go on." They minced along the road. Hello. They minced along the road, Scrooge recognising every glory hole and underpass and cottage, until a bijou marchette downtown appeared in the distance, with its bridge, its Gloria's grotto, and winding river to trade on a Bona's summer's deer. Some shaggy ponies now were trotting towards them with Omis upon their backs, who screeched to other Onis in country gigs and carts, driven by rough trade. All these Omis and Feelies were in great humour, and cackled to each other, until broad fields were so full of dolly music that the crisp air tittered to hear it. "But these are shadows of the fakements that have been," screeched the fairy. "They have no consciousness of us." The dolly travellers came upon, and as they came, Scrooge savvied and named them every Una. Scrooge wiped herself clean. Why was it that she rejoiced beyond all bounds to ogle these Omis? What did her cold youths glisten, and her thumping cheek leap up as they went past? Why was she filled with sparkle and lust when she heard them give each other dolly Christmas, as they parted at the crossroads and byroads for their several homes. What was Dolly Christmas to Scrooge? Out upon Dolly Christmas, what bonaness had it ever been done to her? The school is not quite deserted, cackled the fairy. A solitary chavvy, neglected by her sisters, is minced out of there still. Scrooge screeched as she savoured it, and she sobbed. They minced out of the high road by a well-remembered lane, and soon approached a cottage of naffet red brick, with a little weathered cock, surmounted cupola on the roof, and a colonist bellend hanging on it. It was a large latte, but an owner of broken fortunes, and the spacious offices were little used. Their walls were damp and mossy, their windows broken, and their gates decayed. Fowls clucked and strutted in the stables, and the coach latties and sheds were overrun with grass. Nishka was it more retentive of its ancient state within, for, entering the dreary hall and glancing through the open doors of the latties, they found them naffly furnished, cold as a nun's badge, and multi-vast. There was an earthly savour in the air, and chilly bareness in the place, which associated itself with too much getting up by flaming bush sparkle and not much to eat. They went, the fairy and Scrooge, Ajax the hall, to a door at the back of the letty. It opened before them and disclosed a long, bare naffet room, made barer still by lines of plain deals, forms, and desks. At the owner of these lonely feely omi was vardering the lavs near a feeble binko fakement, and Scrooge parked down upon a form and parnied to ogle her naff-forgotten self as she had used to be. Not a latent echo in the latte, not a squeak or scruffle from the mice behind the panelling, not a drip from the half-thawed waterspouts in the naffet yard behind, not a sigh amongst the leafless boughs of Una despondent poplar, not the idle swinging of an empty store latte door, no, not a clicking in the binko fakement, but fell upon the thumping cheek of Scrooge with softening influence, and parked a freer passage to her tears. The fairy reefed on her arm, and pointed to her fee-layer self, intent upon her vardering the lavs. Suddenly an Omi Palone in foreign frocks, fabulously real and distinct to ogle at, stood outside the window with an axe stuck in her belt, leading by the bridle an ass laden with wood. "Why, it's Ali Baba!" Scrooge exclaimed in ecstasy. "It's a dear, badge, honest Ali Baba. Yes, I know. Una Christmas tempo, when yonder solitary feely was minced out of here all alone, she did come, for the first tempo, just like that. Naff Filiomi, and Valentine, Screech Scrooge, and his wild brother Orson, there they go. And what's his name, who was put down in his drawers, a-lettying at the gate of Damascus? Don't you varder her? And the Sultan's groom turned upside down by Genie, and there upon his head. Serve her right, I'm glad of it. What business had he to be married to the princess?" To hear Scrooge expending all the earnestness of her nature on such subjects, in most extraordinary cattle between tittering and crying, and to varder her heightened and excited eke, would have been surprise to her business cities of the city of Iron instead. "There's the parrot!" screeched Scrooge, green lucoddy and yellow tail, with fakement like a lettuce growing out the top of its head. "There he is! Naff Robin Crusoe," he screeched her, and when he came home again and sailing round the island. "Naff Robin Crusoe, where have you been, Robin Crusoe?" The Omi Palone thought he was dreaming, but he wasn't. It was the parrot, you know. There goes Friday, trolling for his life to the little creek. Halloa, hoop, halloo! Then, with a rapidity of cackling and dolly nature very foreign to his usual character, she screeched, in pity of her former self, "Na filiomi," and screeched again. "I wish," Scrooge muttered, putting her fambul in his pocket and vardering about her after she was drying her news with her cuff, "but it's too late now." "What's the matter?" screeched the fairy. "Nishta," screeched Scrooge, "nishta. There was a feely omi singing a Christmas carol at my door last notchie. It would have been dolly to have parked her something, that's all." The fairy smiled thoughtfully, and waved its fambul, cackling as it did so. "Let us ogle another Christmas." Scrooge's former self grew larger at the loves, and when the room became mungier and multi-dirty, the panels shrunk, the windows cracked, fragments of plaster fell out of the ceiling, and the Nanti Juche laughs were shown instead. But how all of this was brought about, Scrooge savaged no more than you do. She only savaged that it was quite correct, that everything had happened so, that there she was, alone again, when all the other Filiomes had gone around for the jolly holidays. She was not vardering the lads now, but trolling up and down despairingly. Scrooge vavered that the fairy, and, with mournful shaking of her head, glanced anxiously towards the door. It opened, and a bijou feely Palone, much feelier than the Filiome. "Oh, are you okay?" She's barking in her sleep. It opened, and a bijou feely Palone, much feelier than the Filiome, came darting in, and, flinging her arms immelderously behind her neck, and often kissing her, addressed herself as her dear, dear sister. "I have come to parker you home, dear sister," cackled the chavvy, clapping her tiny fambles and bending down to titter. "To parker you home, home, home!" "Home, little fan," returned the feely Omi. "Yes," giggled the feely Palone, brimful of glee. "Home for Bona and all. Home for ever and ever. Badge woman is so kinder than she used to be, that home's like heaven. She spoke so gently to me una dear notchie when I was going to bed, that I was not afraid to ask her once more what you might try if you might troll home, and she screeched yes, you should, and loud me out in a coach to parker you." "And you're to be an Omi Palone," screeched the chavvy, opening her ears, "and are never to troll back here, but first we're to be together all the Christmas long, and have the merriest tempo in all the world." "You are quite a dear dolly sister, excited little fan," exclaimed the Filiome. She clapped her fambles and tittered, and tried to reef her head, but being too little, tittered again, and stood on tiptoe to embrace her. Then she began to drag her, in a chavvyish eagerness, towards the door, and she, nishta loath to go, accompanied her. A nana cackling figment in the hall screeched, "Parker down Mistress Scrooge's box, there." In the hall appeared the schoolmistress herself, who glared on Mistress Scrooge with ferocious condescension, and threw the Filiomi into a dreadful state of mind by shaking fambles with her. She then conveyed Scrooge and her sister into a shivering camp parlour that was ever varded, where the maps upon the wall, and the celestial and terrestrial globes in the windows, were waxy with the cold air. Here she produced a decanter of curiously sparkled daffy juice, and a block of curiously heavy cake, and administered instalments of these dainties to the Filiomes and Palones, at the same tempo allowing out a meagre servant to offer the glass of something to the filly, who had answered that she thanked the mistress, but if it was the same tap that she had tasted before, she'd rather not. Mr. Scrooge's trunk, being by this tempo held on to the top of the chaise, the fillies bowed the schoolmistress farewell right willingly, and getting into it, scurried outrageously down the garden sweep, the quick wheels dashing the hoarfrost and snow from the munge leaves of evergreens like spray. Always a delicate creature, whom a breath might have withered, screeched the fairy, but she has a large thumping cheek. So she had, screeched Scrooge. You're right. I will not gain cackle it, fairy. Gloria for good. She minced off to bide with Gloria a badge alone, screeched the fairy, and had, as I think, feelies. Una chavi, Scrooge returned. True, screeched the fairy, your nephew. Scrooge remembered uneasy in his mind, and answered briefly, yes. Although they had but that moment minced off in the school behind them, they were now at the busy thoroughfares of the city, where shadowy passages passed and repassed, and the shadowy carts and coaches battled for the way, and all the strife and tumult of the real city were. It was made plain enough by the dressing of the bodegas that here too it was Christmas tempo again. But it was bijou noche, and the streets were sparkled up. The fairy stopped at a certain bath-latty door, and screeched to Scrooge if she savoured it. Know it? Screeched Scrooge. Was I apprenticed here? They went in, and vardering of the badge gentle Omi Polone in Irish, parked behind such a high desk, that if she had been dewy 12 inches taller, she might have knocked her head against the ceiling. Scrooge screeched in great excitement. Why, it's Badge Fezziwig, bless her thumping cheek, it's Fezziwig, alive again. Badge Fezziwig loud upon her pen, and varded up to the clock, which pointed to the hour of setter. She rubbed her fumbles, adjusted her capacious waistcoat, tittled all over herself from her slimbacks to her organ of benevolence, and screeched out, in a comfortable, looby, rich, fat, jovial, cackling fakement, Yo-ho there, Mary, Dick! I want Dick! Scrooge's former self, now a grown feely Omi Polone, trolled briskly in, accompanied by her Omi prentice. Dick Wilkins, to be sure, screeched Scrooge to the fairy. Bless me, yes, there she is. She was much attached to me, was Dick. Big Dick, dear, dear. Yo-ho, my filios, screeched Fezziwig. No more acting Dicky this bijou noche. It's Christmas Eve, Dick. Christmas! Mary, let's have the shutters up, cattled Badge Fezziwig, and a sharp claw of her fumbles. Before an Omi Polone can cackle Jack Robinson. You wouldn't believe how these doomy Omis went at it. They charged into the quarter with shutters, Una, Dewey, Tray, and had them up at their palaces, quarter, chinker, cattle, barred them and pinned them, setter, otter, nobber, and came back before you could have got to Kenza, panting like racehorses. Hilly-o! Giggled Badge Fezziwig, skipping down the high desk with fabulosa agility. Clear away, my bean cones. Let's have lots of room here. Hilly-ho, Dick. Cheer up, Mary. Clear away. There was nishta they wouldn't have cleared away, or couldn't have cleared away, with Badge Fezziwig vardering on. It was done in trice duckies. Every movable was packed off, as if it was dismissed from public life for evermore. The floor was swept and watered The binkos were trimmed, fuel was heaped onto the binko pavement, and the bath latte was as snug, as warm, as dry, and as bright as a ballroom as you would ever ogle on a winter's nodgy. In came a fiddler with a music book, and went to the lofty desk, and made an orchestra of it, and tuned like Chinka Dasher stomach aches. In coming Mrs. Fezziwig, una a vast, substantial smile. And in came the tray Ms. Fezziwigs, beaming and lovable. In come say feely followers, whose thumping cheeks they all broke. And in came all the feely omies and palones employed in the business. In came the latte maid with her cousin the bakerette, and in came the cook with her brother's particular sister, the milk omi Palone. In came the feely omi from Ajax's place, who was suspected of not having board enough for her master, trying to hide herself behind the girl from the next door but Una, who was proved to have her Aunt Nelling cheeks pulled by her mistress. In they all came, una after another, some shyly, some boldly, some gracefully, some awkwardly, some pushing, some pulling. In they all came, anyway and anyhow. Away they all went, Dewey-Datcher couple at once, fambles around half and back again the other way, down the middle end and up again, round and round in various stages of affectionate grouping, badge top couple always turning up in the wrong place, new top couple starting off again as they got there, all top couples at last, and not a bottom una to help them. When this result was brought out, Badge Fezziwig, clapping her fambles to stop the wallop, screeched out, "Bona effort, omies," and the fiddler plunged her hot eek into the pot of porter especially provided for that purpose. But, scorning Letty, she instantly began again, though there was no wallop as yet, as the other fiddler had been carried home, exhausted, on a shutter, and there were new Omi Palones resolved to jar her out of Vardering, or perish. There were more wallops, and there were more forfeits, and multi-more wallops, and there were fabulosa cake, and there were negus, and there were a great piece of spit roast chicken, and there was a great piece of cold boiled, and there were mince pies, and plenty of daffy juice. But the great effect of the evening came after the roast and boiled, when the fiddler, an artful girl, with a lovely personality mind, the sort of Omi Palone who savvied her business better than you or I could have cackled it her, struck up Ducky Roger de Coverley. Then Badge Fezziwig stood out to wallop with Mrs. Fezziwig, top couple too, with bone stiff pieces of acting dicky cut out for them, tray or quarter or Dewey-Datcher pair of sisters, Omi et Palones who were not trifled with, Omi et Palones who could wallop, but no intention of trolling. But if they had been twice as Omi Poloni, the quarter tempos, Badge Fezziwig would have had been a match for them, and so would Mrs. Fezziwig, and to her she was Bona to be her sister in every sense of the term. It was not high praise, cackle me higher, and I'll use it. A positive sparkle appeared to be issuing from Fezziwig's calves. They shone in every part of the wallop like the moons. You couldn't have predicted at any parked tempo what would become next. And when Badge Fezziwig and Mrs. Fezziwig had walloped all through the wallop, advance and retire, bow fambles to your sister, bow and curtsy, corkscrew, thread the needle, and back into your place. Fezziwig cut so deftly that she appeared to wink with her scotches, and come back to her plates again Nanty a stagger. When the clock struck lepta, This domestic ball broke up. Mr. and Mrs. Fezziwig held their stations, Una on either side of the door, and shaking fanballs with every Omi individually as he or she went out, wished her or him a dolly Christmas. When everyone had retired but the dewy prentices, they did the same to them, and thus the cheerful cackling fakements minced off to bide with Gloria away, and the Omis were pimped out to their beds, where they were under counter at the back shop, and had Bona trade in their thumping cheeks content. During the whole of this tempo, Scrooge had acted like an Omi Palone out of her wits. Her thumping cheat and Nishtalucoddy were in the scene, and with her former self. She corroborated everything, remembered everything, enjoyed everything, and underwent the strangest agitation. It wasn't until now, when the bright eeks of her former self and Dick were turned from them, that she remembered the fairy, and became conscious that it was vardering full upon her, when the sparkle of its head burnt very clear. A pogy matter, screeched the fairy, to make these silly folk so full of gratitude. Pogy? Bitched Scrooge. The fairy screeched to her to Nelliada, to the dewy apprentices who were pouring out their thumping cheeks in praise of Fezziwig, and when she had done so, screeched, Why, is it not she has spent but nishta dowry pounds on your mortal denali, tray or quarter perhaps? Is that so much that she deserves this praise? It isn't that, screeched Scrooge, buggered by the remark, and cackling unconsciously like her former, not her latter self. It isn't that, fairy. She has the power to render us happy or unhappy, and make our service sparkle or burdensome, a pleasure or a toil. Cackle that her power lies in lavs and posers, and in fakements so dolly and insignificant that it is impossible to add and count them up. What then? The happiness she gives is quite as great as if it costs a fortune. She felt the Aris ogle, and stopped. What the hell is the matter now, for fuck's sake? Screeched the fairy. Nishta particular, muttered Scrooge. Something, I think, dear? The fairy insisted. Nanty, screeched the school. Nanty. I should like to be able to cackle una lav or dewey to my Clarkess just now, that's all. Her former self turned down the binkos as she parked utterance to the wish, and Scrooge and the fairy again stood side by side in open air. My tempo grows short, ogled the fairy. Quick! This was not addressed to Scrooge, or to any Una whom she could ogle, but it produced an immediate effect, for again Scrooge farded herself. She was badgier now, an Omi Palome in the prime of her life. Her eek had not the harsh and rigid lines of letter Annie's, but had begun to wear the signs of care and avarice. There was an eager, greedy, luttyless motion in the yews, which showed the passion that had lull and rot, and where the shadow of the growing tree would fall. She was not alone, but parked by the side of a fair Feely Palone in morning dress, whose yews there were tears, and sparkled in the sparkle that shone out of the fairy of Christmas past. It matters little, she screeched softly, to you, very little. Another idol has displaced me, and if I can cheer or comfort you in tempo, as I would have tried to do, I would not have caused it to grieve. What idol has displaced you? She rejoined. A Gelton, Una. That is the fate of the world, she screeched. There is Nishta on which is so hard as Nishta Denali, and there is Nishta it professes to condemn with such severity as the pursuit of Metis. You fear the world too much, she answered gently. All your other hopes had merged into the hope of being una beyond the chance of sordid reproach, and I have avoided your nobler aspirations, fall off by una and una, until the master passion, gain, engrosses you. Have I not? What then? She retorted. Even if I have grown so much wiser, what then? I am not changed towards you. She shook her head. Am I? Our contract is with a badge una, dear. It was made when we were both naff and content to be so, until, in Bona season, we could improve our worldly fortune by our patient industry. You are changed. When it was made you were another Omi Polone. I was a Omi, Mary screeched impatiently. Your own feeling cackles you that you were not what you are, she returned. I am. That which proclaimed happiness when we're una in thumping cheat is fraught with misery now that we are dewy. How often and how keenly have I thought of this? I will not cackle. Is it enough that I have thought of it and can release you? Have I ever sought release? In lavs? No, never. In what then? In a changed nature, in an altered fairy, in another atmosphere of life, another hope as its great end, in everything that made my love any worth or valuing in your vardering. If this had never been between us, screeched the girl, vardering mildly, but with steadiness upon her, cackle me. Would you ogle me out to try and win me now? Ah, no. She varded to yield the justice of this supposition in spite of herself, but she screeched with a struggle. You think not? I would gladly think otherwise if I could, she answered. Heaven knows, when I have learned a truth like this, I know how butch and irresistible it must be. But you were free this journey. Tomorrow, yesterday. Can even I believe that you would choose a dowerless girl, you who in your very confidence with her weigh everything by gain, or by choosing her, if for a moment you are false enough in your una guiding principle to do so, you will not. Do I not know that your repentance and regret would surely follow? I do, and I release you, with a full thumping cheat, for the love of her you once were. Mary was about to cackle, but with her head turned, the Polone resumed. You may, at the memory of what was half past makes me hope you will, have pain in this, a very, very brief tempo, and you will dismiss the recollection of it gladly, as an unprofitable dream, from which it happened well that you awoke. May you be happy in the life that you have chosen. She minced out on her, and they parted. Thank fuck. Fairy, screeched Scrooge, show no more of this drear. Conduct me home that I may ogle the reruns of Falcon Crest. Why do you think it dolly to torture me? Una shadow more, exclaimed the fairy. No more, screeched Scrooge. No more. I do not wish to ogle it. Show me no more, you Nanasow. But the relentless fairy groped her in both arms and forced her to her knees before its cartso to observe what happened next. They were in another scene and place, a room, not very large or bona, but full of comfort. Near to winter binko fakement sat a beautiful Feely Polone, so that at last Scrooge believed it was the same, until she varded her, now a comely matron, letting opposite her Polone chavvy. The noise in this room was perfectly tumultuous, for there were no more feelies there than for there were more feelies there than Scrooge in her agitated state of mind could count, and unlike the celebrated herd in the poem, they were not a quarter-dashy feelies conducting themselves like Una, but every feelie was conducting itself like a quarter-dasher. The consequences was uproarious beyond belief, but no Una was narky about it. On the contrary, the mother and Polone chavvy tittered heavily, and enjoyed it very much, and the latter, soon beginning to mingle in the sports, got pillaged by the feely brigands most ruthlessly. What would I've not parked to be Una of them, though I could have never had been so rude. No, it wouldn't for the Metis of all the world have crushed that braided rear, and torn it down, for the precious little bat, I would have plucked it off. Gloria bless my Nishta Lakodi, to save my life, as to measuring her waist in sport as they did bold Omi's brood, I couldn't have done it. I should have expected my arm to have grown around it for jasasement, and never straight again. And yet I should have dearly liked, I own, to have reefed her lips, to have questioned her, that she may have opened them, to have varded upon the lashes of her downcast ewes, and never raised a blush, to have let loose waves of rire, an inch of which would have been a keepsake beyond price. In short, I would have liked, I do dish, to have had the lightest licence of a feelie, and yet to have been an Omi Polone enough to know its value. But now a knocking at the door was heard, and such a rush immediately ensued that she, with tittering eke and plundered dress, was borne towards it in the centre of flushed and boisterous group, just in tempo to greet the badge Omi, who had come home attended by an Omi Polone laded by Christmas toys and presents. Then the shouting and the struggling and the onslaught that was made in the defenceless porter, the scaling her with chairs for ladders, to dive in her pockets, to spoil her of brown paper parcels, hold on tight by her cravat, hug around her back, pummel her Aris, and kick her lallies into irrepressible affection. The shouts of wonder and delight with which the development of every package was lulled, the Nana announcement that the lullaby cheat had been lulled in the act of putting a doll's frying pan into its mouth, and there was more than suspected of having jarried a fictitious turkey glued on a wooden platter. The immense relief of finding this false alarm, the joy, the gratitude, the ecstasy, they were all indescribable alike. It is enough that by degrees the feelies and their emotions got out of the parlour, and by Una stair at the tempo, up to the top of the latte, where they went to bed, and so subsided. And now Scrooge varded on more attentively than ever, when the mistress of the latte, having her Polone chavvy leaning fondly on her, sat down with her and her mother at her own binko fakement side, and when she thought that such another creature, quite as graceful and full of promise, might have screeched her badge man, and been a spring tempo in the haggard winter of her life, her vardering grew very dim indeed. Bell end, screeched the husband, turning to her Polone affair with a smile. I varded a badge sister of yours this afternoon. Who was it? Guess. How can I? Don't I know? She added in the same breath, tittering as she tittered. Mrs. Scrooge. Mrs. Scrooge it was. I passed her office window and as if it was not shut up, she had a flaming bush inside. I could scarcely help fathering her. Her sister lies upon the point of carking it, I hear, and there she sat, a Luna, quite a Luna in the world, I do believe. Miserable Bagvash. Fairy! Screeched Scrooge in a broken, cackling vagament. Remove me from this place at once. I screecheth you that these were shadow of the vagrants that have been, screeched the fairy. That they are what they are. Nix blame me, dear. Remove me, Scrooge exclaimed all dramatically. I cannot bear it. She turned upon the fairy, and vardering that it had vardered upon her with an eek, in which some strange way there were fragments of all the eeks that she had trayed with, and showed her, wrestled with it. Leave me, lull me back, haunt me no longer, you Nanazelda. In the struggle in which they screeched, a struggle in which the fairy, with no visible resistance on its own part, and undisturbed by any effort of its adversary, Scrooge ogled that the sparkling was burning high and bright, and dimly connecting that with its influence over her. She seized the extinguisher cap, and by sudden action pressed it down upon the fairy's head. She'd crowned the bitch. The fairy dropped beneath it, so that the extinguisher covered its whole form. But though Scrooge pressed down upon it with all her force, more than what she had bounced and bobbed to the Collins of rough trade that owed her denari, she could not hide that sparkle which streamed from under it in an unbroken flood upon the ground. She was conscious of being exhausted, and overcome by an irresistible drowsiness, and further, of being in her own bedroom. Totally daffied out of her head, she parted the cap and parting squeeze, in which her fambul relaxed, and had barely a temple to reel up to bed before she sank into a heavy lettying. Thank the drowners. Merry Christmas.